Hello, I'm Radical Liberation from St. Louis, Missouri, USA, and I have with me the Mad Mercenary from somewhere in Australia. We're going to cover a couple things rapid fire and then get into a main topic, and then maybe have a bonus topic. We'll see how our time goes. First of all, Mises Institute is doing something rather cool, and I wanted to highlight it. Let's see. And that is the Human Action Podcast. Let's see. I guess the best way is to share that. Sorry, thinking on the fly here. To center tab. Yeah, there we go. Let's share that. Okay, so this is coming from the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. I've been there 20 times. I don't know. I've often gone there. And Bob Murphy is starting a new series, which will actually be articles, right, Matt Burke? Not.
Yes.
It's starting with an introductory podcast, but actually the series is articles. And I actually haven't even listened to the introductory podcast. So, but Mad Merc, you did a little bit. So tell us what they're up to with this.
Yeah, so basically this will go into detail on how the Fed actually works. Not just like, so they wanted to combat in this the simplification that the Austrian or monetarist schools do with the Fed. So often you'll hear with the Austrian school, well, the Fed will just print money. Well, what's the actual operation of that? What's the step-by-step process? How does this work? What are the dynamics? How can we combat this in an effective manner and understand and not just look like fools when a Keynesian or a monetarist who's more in favor of government control comes and says, well, what about this? It's to try and combat that. It's to try and get Austrians informed on the function and the operation of the Fed.
In a way that hopefully the value Bob Murphy is bringing is taking something that is genuinely complicated and explaining it in a way that mortals can understand, right?
Right, and it's very enjoyable to listen to. I had it on the background while I was reading some Twitter, and I was able to follow it just fine. So don't be afraid to listen to it. It's not going to be overly complex if you don't know a whole lot about the Fed. That's what it's made for. It's there to simply explain it.
Yeah, excellent. I was going to name drop briefly, which is just that a chief program at the Mises Institute is the summer program. It's called Mises Institute, I believe, Mises U. And when I went to that 20 years ago or whatever it was, that was actually Bob Murphy's probably first time at the Mises Institute. And I was going through that program with Bob, and then Tom was there somehow, I think, as well. Tom Woods. But anyway, that's when I first got to know Bob and Tom back then. And Tom, of course, has turned out to be an excellent economist, an excellent explainer of economics. So I am very excited about this series and really recommend everyone pay attention to it. Okay, next. I do not want to do a big Iran thing because, for one thing, I don't know anything about Iran. But I did want to share a few things. So let me share an article. I'll flash it on the screen, and then also let's see, here we go. Yeah, so this is from Jacob Hornberger. And this is old. He did this because of September 9/11 and what was coming out of 9/11. But he starts in 1951 and starts getting into the CIA and what they were up to in Iran back in the 50s and leads up to what happens later. And it shows the interplay between the US, Iran, and Iraq. And I thought that even though it's 17 years out of date, he hasn't covered things like the invasion of Iraq, which is a pretty big thing to not cover. Still, I thought maybe the more recent history might be something that people know about, but this older history you might not know about. So I think that's a really valuable resource. So let me share that link as well. And then, if somehow, and I don't know how anyone in our audience would have missed it, but if somehow you've missed it, Academic Agent did a very unusual video, and I have shared that link. And let's see, I guess I'll flash it on the screen too. Because Academic Agent, I think, probably has never before, that I know of, done a video that he did not author. He's always reading reading his own script or sharing his own thoughts. He did not author this. This was actually authored by his father, who's from Iran, and is I gather no fan of the current government in Iran, to say the least, but has stayed very much in touch. Keeping in conversation with friends and family in Iran for the last 40 years. And so he provides some amazing context. As I shared on Twitter, it's a 360-degree view. He not only covers one of the things that was most interesting, which was the November revolt, which sounded very much like a populist revolt along the lines of the Yellow Vests in France. It was even over petrol taxes or petrol prices, something like that, just like with the Yellow Vests. The Iranian government put it down pretty brutally. So he covers that and sort of the discontent within Iran with the current regime. But then it gets into this whole section where he's talking about Iran's relationship with like almost every other country. Like I don't even know how many countries he goes through, but he talks about the commercial or foreign policy relationship between Iran and France, Iran and Germany, Iran and Turkey, so on and so forth. So it really, that's why I said 360-degree view. It really comes at understanding where Iran is in the international situation from a number of angles. Both the international and the domestic situation. So you don't have to have, a side about what happened with the killing of the Iranian general or the U.S. empire or anything like that to benefit from just learning from that. So I wanted to highlight that. And then you had something to highlight as well, Mad Merc?
Oh, yes. Just that within the last week with the killing of Soleimani, it's excuse me if I'm not pronouncing the name right, but
Yeah.
I think you have to look at the broader picture. This wasn't an isolated attack. There was reason behind it. So within the last week, there was a, shall we say, incident at a U.S. embassy that was believed to have him involved. And a week later, the guy's dead.
Mm-hmm.
So I would suggest people start with the article I'm linking. It's by Peter Zion. It's a roundup of what's been happening within the Middle East at the moment, and the tensions heating up, and the withdrawal, and a broader situational look at why this incident happened.
And I am just opening a tab with that article for myself. Thank you. Yeah, Peter's, is it Zihan? How do you say it?
I've heard it pronounced both ways, but I think it's Zihan.
Zihan, okay. Yeah, Peter Zihan does seem to be a rather astute commentator on a lot of things. But I guess, could you give like the things that he's best on, in your view?
I think he's best in understanding the history behind what the current situation is and how these old dynamics come back into play. I think that's a good summary of what he does really, really good. He sees how history and geography intermingle and create situations and how people act and their incentives within the world.
Well, that is a nice intro to our main topic, our main announced topic today, because what the paper we're going to look at ends up doing is saying that you have to look at something like economic growth in historical context, and in this case, in the context of international relations. So that sounds sort of like just the kind of thing that would be down Zihan's, can't say it right, down his alley, right?
Yes, yes. I think understanding history and understanding the pre-existing relationships between nations is a great start.
Okay, so this is the paper, and I have a bunch of highlights. So I was just going to start, and then hopefully you can just sort of jump in as you want to highlight something or comment on something. Because I thought, first of all, let's just go through and in some depth summarize what the paper says, and then we'll discuss a little more. Is that okay?
Yes. Do you just want to remove the comment from the screen so people
Oops,
can
thank
see
you.
the full text? Yeah. No worries.
Yep. Thanks for tipping me off to that. And how do I do that? Okay. I actually have to find your comment, scroll up, find it, so I can turn it off. Oh, there it is. Okay, got it. Thank you. Excellent. So, right. So, America's role in the making of Japan's economic miracle. Michael Beckley, Yusaku Horiuchi, and Jennifer Miller. Jennifer Miller. That name sounds familiar. Anyway. Okay, so first, the thing to be explained needs to be highlighted.
Go ahead.
So the growth rate between 1959 and 1970 for Japan, as measured by GDP, I think, was above 10%. That is double-digit growth in 8 out of 12 years. I'm not going to assume everybody knows what a good growth rate is, but a rather typical growth rate for a developed economy is in the 1% to 3% range. Does that seem fair, Madmer?
Yeah, but you would consider your economy doing very well if you're like 5%. That would be a great year of growth.
Great year of growth.
So double digits for a industrialized nation is absolutely fantastic.
Right, exactly. So this really stands out. Not only does Japan's growth stand out when we look at economic development in general, but it even stands out for Japan. And that's really what the paper focuses in on. They didn't just grow at 10% or 12% or whatever once World War II concluded and just keep growing that way the whole time. It really was this period, 1959 to 70, which I'll from now on just refer to as the 60s, which isn't quite right, but is the short way to say it. So basically, during the 60s, Japan had this phenomenal accelerated growth. And so this is quite interesting. Jumping slightly to the end here, it's interesting in part because a number of other countries would sure love to do that, right? They'd sure love to be able to repeat what happened in Japan. So there's been a lot of debate, and I remember discussions about this back in the 90s when Japan's economy was pretty hot and books were being published and Wall Street Journal articles were being published and so forth, saying that Japan had a different economic model and we needed to be like them or we were going to be left in the dust, So anyway, so what happened? First, let me give the standard tale, and then we're going to get into the revisionist history of this paper. So the standard tale, I'll just read this part. A coalition of Japanese bureaucrats and business persons set Japan on a path of export-led growth, made in Japan, right, which I remember very well from when I was young, buoyed by massive domestic investment, foreign technology acquisition, protectionist barriers, and well-designed industrial policies. And as a result of all these great government policies, Japan had this fabulous growth. Okay. Their thesis, in a nutshell, and then we'll get into the details, is that this story is wrong, at least about this amazing accelerated burst of growth in the 1960s. That maybe some of that list there can explain the growth that Japan had before and after the 60s, but it doesn't really explain what happened in the 60s. And that a better explanation has to do with the relationship between the United States and Japan. And we'll understand what that means in a moment. Okay, so the way they are going to come at this, well, no, I'm going to come back to that. Okay, so here's a sentence that deserves to be read out. Japan's post-war economic growth miracle is often cited as clear evidence of the virtues of the East Asian model, an ambitious growth blueprint that entails considerable state intervention in the economy. So hopefully now it becomes obvious why this seemingly possibly obscure topic is something I wanted to talk about. Japan's growth has been used as an argument for state intervention into the economy because they're saying, well, that's why they were so successful. I may be wrong, but I wonder if our bête noire, Ray Mirasamy, has maybe said something like this at points. I seem to remember her saying such things.
The less said about Ray, probably the better.
Right. She has ears everywhere. Anyway.
You're assuming she's a woman.
But these authors think that that's not right. And what they're challenging is they're saying that they don't think that you can simply do the policies like the state-led economic growth policies in another country and duplicate that dramatic double-digit growth for 10 years that Japan had in the 60s. They're saying, in fact, what happened there, well, I'll read, required exceptional international circumstances that no longer exist and are unlikely to return anytime soon. So what's at stake in this paper is really quite large. It's, can you duplicate Japan or can't you? They say you can't. Or, well, not that you can't, but you're probably not going to be able to, basically. Certainly not on your own. You would need something like the United States to work with you. Okay, so let's tell the history story of their story, their revisionist history of what happened in Japan. Rather than these, bureaucrats and business people getting together and big government and big state working together in, one might say, a quasi-fascist manner, using fascist in the proper original Italian fascist term. Instead, they say what happened is that something happened politically in the late 50s, which resulted in a change in the economic environment for Japan. Specifically, it had to do with, no surprise, the Cold War. The Japanese economy in the early to mid 50s was treading water, not moving forward, they mentioned. And Japan was starting to get friendly with countries like the Soviet Union and Communist China. I think also they had a socialist party that was competitive in the political sphere. So
it was a threat. It was enough of a threat to be recognized by both Kishi Nobusuke, which was the prime minister who wanted to increase relationships with Eisenhower, and by the United States themselves. So,
right,
if they're running that sort of a, if they're being monitored by the Japanese government and the United States, you could pretty much tell it's serious.
Right, and so what happened is that the prime minister of Japan became seriously ill in 1957, and he was replaced by someone who we will refer to as Kishi, so we don't have to keep destroying his last name. He was replaced by Kishi.
Send you his picture on Twitter.
Oh, say it again? There's a picture of
I'll
him?
send you his picture on Twitter.
Okay, yeah.
That way everyone has a
up.
face they can visualize to this.
That's a great idea, actually, yes. Totally agree. So Kishi comes into office, and he takes a hard turn away from the policies that Japan had been creeping towards. Namely, he's a staunch anti-communist. He wants Japan to be closer to the United States rather than developing these relationships with countries the United States was kind of in conflict with, right? It also mentions he had a great willingness to crack down on leftist activism. So you could say he was sort of a Japanese version of the academic agent, I guess, in that sense.
He was also accused of being a Class A war criminal in World War II. So not exactly a nice fellow, too.
Right. But
just so everyone's not saying he's the Pinochet of Japan. No, he's also pretty nasty dude.
Well, I think most people think Pinochet was fairly nasty too. So, yeah.
That depends. He did nothing wrong, so.
Right. So Kishi and Eisenhower in mid-1957 decide to make a deal, and it says that, let's see, in a joint statement they declared Japan and the United States are entering a new era, firmly based on common interests and trust. And for once, the political speak was absolutely a description of what happened, because they totally entered a new era, the two countries. They changed their security agreement, where Japan still had, I guess, a military. They were paying for military somehow. Maybe they were paying for the U.S.
They had a self-defense force.
Okay. And I think they were picking up part of the cost of the U.S. being there, the U.S. military being there.
Yes.
Anyway, without getting into all the details, the net result of the agreement was that Japan's defense costs went down to a rounding error. They reduced Japanese defense spending quite a bit. Another thing that happened is that the United States orchestrated a series of low-interest loans to Japan. So Japan's costs went down for defense. Their access to credit went up. Okay. Go ahead.
And most importantly, they opened up the United States market to Japanese exports.
Right. Now,
which is probably the most important thing.
Right. And I grew up with the Made in Japan thing and everyone freaking out that, Detroit was being destroyed. The car manufacturing in Detroit because of Japanese car makers and so on and so forth. What I didn't know is that it wasn't always this way, and that Eisenhower personally made a big push to reduce tariffs that were affecting Japanese exports to the United States. And he was very successful. So much so, I wonder if I can find this. I'm not sure I can find the exact figure, but it was something like 30%, I recall. Japan ended up at a point where 30% of their exports were just to the United States. Oh yeah, there we go. Over the subsequent decade, the 60s, the United States absorbed more than 30% of Japan's exports, a situation comparable to Bulgaria's export dependence on the Soviet Union. So this became a huge part of what Japan was doing commercially. And so this meant talking down some protectionist demands from U.S. interest groups. And, basically Eisenhower played political hardball to make it easier for Japan to ship stuff to the United States. Okay, right. So what happened? As a result of these policies on the exports, American purchases from Japan increased by more than 150% from 1958 to 1960. Let me say that one more time. So 150%, remember, is a doubling and a half, right? So it doubled and a half in 2 years. So dramatic change as you enter the 60s. It said Japan had its first ever trade surplus because of this. And then, right, so that's on the exports. And then finally, and I don't know how much weight to put on this, maybe this is more your area, Matt Merck, to comment on, but just to give the facts and then you can comment. The Japanese Socialist Party, as we mentioned, was something they were concerned about. And so the United States intervened financially in Japanese politics. I guess you could think like George Soros kind of activity, right? They started giving millions of dollars in secret campaign funds to Kishi and other LDP politicians. And LDP was the dominant party in Japan forever until I think quite recently. And so they claim in this paper, they actually they have a footnote for it, for whatever that's worth. Scholarly research suggests that maintaining political stability was another likely determinant of Japan's economic growth spurt. So I guess the idea is that if people feared that the socialists would get into power, then they'd be less likely to invest. Robert Higgs had this about FDR. I think he called it regime uncertainty, maybe. That's the idea that if you are afraid that your government is about to seize the means of production, you're very unlikely to want to invest anything into building up means of production. So I guess the idea is that they created a situation by funding the LDP and attacking the Socialist Party in whatever dirty means they use, as usual. They created a situation where people in Japan, foreign investors and Japanese investors weren't afraid to invest and build up productive capacity. So anything else you want to say on that, the political aspect here?
Yeah, I think that's one aspect of it. I think another aspect you could look at very clearly is just from a strategic point of view. If you have a politically unstable nation that's meant to be your spear point in Asia, you don't have a very good spear point. So if you're constantly having to deal with social unrest in the country that's meant to be your base of operations for you to keep the communist threat contained in Asia, so stopping Chinese expansion south, so we see from the domino theory, if you're constantly having to deal with Japan's internal problems, that's not a good thing. So internal stability and political stability in that sense is also from a strategic view. The economic view, you pointed out correctly that investors don't particularly like it if there's a threat of your stuff being taken away and seized. And that's essentially the two main ones that you really need to worry about for statecraft, but there are a couple others, but I think those are the main two.
Thank you. Late, but here's Kishi in the middle, seated, with Eisenhower on the left, probably at that, possibly at that very meeting where this statement was made and the new era was kicked off. Okay, so they talk about some details I don't want to get into, but they continue on the story into the Kennedy administration, that in 1961 they lowered tariffs on a broad range of Japanese products, so even more help to Japan. Yeah, this is a good quote. The U.S. desire to consolidate the Cold War alliance provided Japan the opportunity to crack the lucrative American market, and Japanese industry seized the moment. Yeah, I'm sorry. I skated by the crucial thing that is your area, Mad Merc. Why did they care so much about keeping Japan on side? Why would that matter to the United States?
Well, you got to keep the red dog under heel, don't you? The red dog of communism. So U.S. strategic interest at the time was very much centered around containing the communist threat. The communists were a threat since the 20s, since they had mass spy operations and infiltration within the United States and other Western nations. And they became, after World War II, a very prominent threat, especially in Europe and especially in Asia, with the Communist Party takeover of China. Now, we know at this time Mao is in power, and Mao is looking to consolidate his power. So 1951, the Korean War, he's at war with the United States, along with North Korea and Russian advisors, shall we say. And so communism is a very real threat. And we see this later on in the 60s and 70s with the domino theory in Vietnam. So keeping Japan, a nation that traditionally is one of the most powerful nations in Asia, being very expansionist, having tendencies to invade Korea every time. Uh, it was to keep Japan on side is very, very important. It keeps a sword at the back of the communists.
Mm.
And so to keep them on side, you have to make them a shining beacon of what the West has to offer. Just like Berlin, just like West Germany, you make these nations that were once your enemies into the poster child of what the West can offer. And by showing what the West can offer, you keep a sword at the communists' back. And you're able to use military operations from a base in Japan.
I wanted to give one piece of color to this story here. Try not to be too dry. Kishi. So his war criminal past caught up with him in a sense. This is again the man seated in the middle in the picture we have up, because he actually didn't last long. He got this bill put together with Eisenhower and then pretty much resigned. The reason is that he was a little forceful in how he did his politicking. Let's see. So on the revised security treaty with the United States, the Socialist Party in the Diet, their Congress or Parliament or whatever, tried to stop the voting. So Kishi solved this problem by ordering 500 policemen to remove them. So he literally went in and took the representatives or the members of parliament or whatever you want to call them and just took them out. And then the Diet passed the treaty in the absence of the socialist representatives. I hesitate to even bring this up because I could have imagined the Remainers doing that very thing if they'd thought of it. So anyway, Kishi had to resign because of that. But under the Prime Minister Ikeda Hayato, I'm probably not saying that right, Hayato, they continue these policies through the 60s with the good results we've been describing, the double-digit growth throughout the 60s. Now, do you want to bookend this very briefly? It did come to an end. Let's see, by the end of the 60s, American leaders facing a costly war in Vietnam, an expanding trade deficit, tepid economic growth, had become less tolerant of Japan's privileged position in U.S. economic and security policy. In 1969, Nixon pulled tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers out of Asia and declared that U.S. allies would have to assume the primary responsibility of providing the manpower for their defense. Hey, that's like Trump said he would do, at least.
Is doing.
Okay, he is pulling. Okay. In 1971, the Nixon administration abandoned the dollar's peg to gold, imposed a 10% surcharge on imports. So the Japanese export free ride came to an end. And Nixon later described these policies as an effort to, quote, stick it to the Japanese. So if their thesis is right, what should we expect to see? Well, Japan's annual economic growth rate plunged from 10%, the average in the 1960s, to 3% in 1971, where it remained until the 1980s. Okay, so we have economic growth popping up as a result, this paper argues, of these policies with the this agreement with the United States, and then popping back down when the ride was over. So it seems like a pretty strong argument merely from that anecdotal evidence. I did want to highlight something real quick that just because it's relevant. Polyphant says, was this similar to Marshall Aid? I wish I was more of a Marshall Aid expert. One thing I know for sure is that Marshall Aid involved loans, low interest loans to the countries that were recovering from World War II. And that is part of what we shared here. What I don't know is whether the United States made any kind of deals to support the export markets of the European countries. Deals is dramatic. They did. Oh, some of that as well.
So this is actually a standard part of U.S. policy during the Cold War. You open the U.S. market up to allow nations who have been ravaged by war to export their way back into affluence,
Mm,
so then you can use them in the alliance system against the Soviets.
got it.
Because
Okay.
if you have a look, the Soviets, when they took over the Eastern Bloc, uh, they were basically building the crap out of them to try and use them as a defensive border. So as defensive buffer states. And so they were putting factories in there and they were making large infantry heavy standard armies. And so the West is looking at this and they're like, holy crap, these guys are going to invade us. Little do they know it's actually a defensive measure. So they influenced the Marshall Plan to try and bring these countries back up into a standard of living that is acceptable so they won't go over to communism. And they also do the same things, such as in Japan, of influence political elections. So in Greece and Italy especially, they funded millions of dollars into the anti-communist party.
Mhm.
And unlike Japan, in the Marshall Plan in the West, they actually give direct resources. So, for example, in Greece, a large part of the population was agricultural heavy, and they needed donkeys to, pull the plows. Well, all the donkeys were dead during World War II, so they brought in Missouri mules. And these are much bigger than the standard donkeys that they had in Greece. And the Greeks didn't turn communist because now they actually were able to feed themselves. So a little bit different in different areas, but the essential plan of bringing these countries back up the affluence by opening the U.S. market to their exports is definitely a main pillar of the strategy the United States was implementing at the time.
Okay, so I guess the one thing that I'm surprised by then, because I did read the whole paper, I don't think they talk about comparing and contrasting with the effects of U.S. policies on these European countries. That is, why didn't, because I assume they didn't, why didn't we see 10 years of double digit growth for West Germany or whatever, you know?
Right. So I think this comes back down to the position that these countries were in after World War II. So Japan was now a subservient nation to the United States in every aspect. They were under military occupation. The leaders were being arrested for war crimes. They were not allowed to have a military. They only got their freedom back semi uh, independent status from the United States back in, well, I believe it was 1951 that the paper suggested. Unlike in Europe, where the United Kingdom is still a sovereign nation. They had Clement Attlee, who nationalized everything he could touch. Uh, the French, who are French and will nationalize and have as a core pillar of their economy that they have very few nationalized industries within certain regions that then operate as proxies of the state. So these also, they're highly unstable internally due to the culture and historical reasons of France. So, these sorts of differences really play out in the economic growth.
Okay, so
And this
go
is a
ahead.
similar situation to Germany. So Germany is also described as a miracle after World War II, and they're
That's
in a
true.
very similar circumstance. They were subservient. They didn't have full independence. They were under military occupation, and so their policy couldn't be as influenced by the domestic level.
Okay, I am going to highlight. Okay, so the next part of the paper gets into their attempt to scientifically test this, and I am not qualified to critique their approach. It's interesting, but they basically try to create a fake Japan, statistically speaking, um, and compare it to what happened. Basically, compare a Japan that didn't have the effects, try to factor out the effects of the United States, and then
So
show.
we list what we do is we list all the effects that were, excuse me, all the uh, items in the economy that were having effects on it, and then we give them weighted averages. So for example, oil or whatever is given a certain weighted average of the whole, and then we hold some and adjust others to give you this synthetic Japan. And we see trying to keep the pre 1958 intervention situation going in a
Right.
synthetic way and compare this to the post 1958.
To the actual Japan. So in the chart we've got up, the black line is what actually happened, and the gray
Yes.
line is their model of what they think Japan's growth might have been without U.S. intervention. Now, first thing to notice is that the gray line is still great. Like any country would be happy to be that gray line, right? It's still very respectable economic growth throughout the 60s. But of course, what we saw in Japan was really crazy, dramatic, accelerated growth. And that's that black line, which just shoots up relative to the gray line. I wasn't going to try, Mad Merc, to go into any of that. Just, for those who are geeky enough to get into their model and how they're using it to test and so forth, you have at it. Did we put the paper? When you get a chance,
Yes, we put it in.
Oh, is the link in the
Yes.
chat? Okay. Good. Then let me just jump to the conclusion of the paper, and then we might turn to one more topic. Okay, so their conclusion, I'll just read out a couple things I highlighted. Japan had the good fortune to rebuild its economy during the Cold War, when the most powerful country in the world needed strong allies. Poor countries today confront a far less nurturing international environment than Japan enjoyed in the 1950s and 1960s. With the Cold War over, the United States is less willing to tolerate protectionism or curtail its own prosperity for the sake of other countries. And yes, there's a footnote that refers to Trump. Let me read it. In fact, the United States itself, under the new leadership of President Trump, is pursuing protectionist policies in favor of the United States at the possible cost of other trade partners. So this is a very different approach than you had Eisenhower taking with Japan, as we discussed in the late 50s. Many of the
Well, again,
Go ahead.
they're two different situations.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
economic policy is obviously driven by the strategic need of the day. So the strategic need of the day under Eisenhower was to create this bulwark against communism and bring these countries into a position to where they could be useful in that defense. The strategic interest of today is very, very different. We no longer need that because there is no more communism. There is no more existential threat to America.
So a couple of things. Also, in terms of poor countries trying to do what Japan did, many of the tools that Japan used are now regulated or banned by the World Trade Organization. What are those tools? Export subsidies, import tariffs, foreign investment restrictions. It's a little unclear to me as a free trader why they think import tariffs are going to help the economy
Certain
grow.
amounts of the rate. So you can't have one at like 500% or something like that.
Right, but they're saying that that's a tool that Japan used to stimulate growth, import tariffs. Whereas as an economist, I would say that import tariffs are a way to damage your economy. But anyway, that's something I'd have to debate with the authors, I guess. Okay, so they conclude we should not expect to see many Japan-style miracles in the future. This implies that the economic gap between rich and poor countries will remain stubbornly persistent. And I have to say, this is something I didn't really understand. I wanted to read this footnote because this was new to me. For all the talk of global economic convergence, it is important to note that the difference in income levels between developed and developing countries remains as wide today as it was in 1950. Even the most successful developing countries have had trouble catching up. China, for example, still ranks 92nd in the world in terms of per capita income and continues to lag far behind OECD countries in terms of innovation. I think I'd been thrown off by all the charts, which are marvelous charts, right, showing that absolute poverty is really diminishing, which is, wonderful and encouraging. But basically, while so much of the third world is rising out of abject poverty, the developed world is continuing to get richer and richer and richer, right? So if you look at it just from a relative point of view, the disparities continue to be pretty much, they're saying, stable. It kind of blows my mind. They're saying that for 70 years, the disparities have not really changed that much.
Yeah, but that's standard. We're not worried about the difference between rich and poor. We're worried about how difficult is it to raise in the ranks. So again, this is kind of like income inequality or
yeah.
that
Oh
sort
no,
of
I agree. No, I'm not
So-
concerned about it. I'm just saying that this was new information to me. I guess I thought
Okay.
there was some kind of convergence. I don't remember anyone saying that. I just kind of had formed a vague picture. Hey, well, so many parts of the world are doing so much better and they're not starving to death anymore. We're probably all going to be middle class together, right? Well, that's not what's happening.
No.
So new to me there. And then
And
this one
I
is,
doubt these places will grow much further for much longer. So
oh, well, that's a different discussion.
It
And then here's the music to Mad Merck's ears, one of their final points. Most important point to be made, therefore, is that the study of economic development should pay closer attention to historically specific geopolitical contexts. And there's a career for Mad Mercenary right there in that little statement, right?
Oh yeah.
That's your bailiwick.
I am trying desperately to get a job in that field, and
Yeah.
it's fucking barren.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes. But yeah, if you could break in, that would be something you would love to make contributions on, which would be awesome.
Oh hell yeah.
Okay, so that is the paper. Did you have, I mean, we kind of made comments as we went, so I don't feel like we need to go on talking about it a whole bunch, and we'll have questions about it. So did you have any sort of final thoughts before we maybe look at questions?
No, I think we can get on to questions.
Okay, well, I'm not seeing a lot, so I think that'll be okay. Let's see. Roger wants to pull a Stalin on Mad Merck. Please don't explain. I just like to throw that out for people to wonder about. Okay.
Yeah.
Here's one. Internal libertarianism, outward protectionism is the future. Autarky 2050. I won't comment. I just thought that was funny.
I actually I will comment on that.
Okay.
I think that actually strikes on something really cool. The idea of spheres and spheres of power. So let's take the British Empire, for example. Milton Friedman points this out very clearly. At the height of the British Empire, government spending in GDP was 10%. Can you imagine that today? Running a global empire and only government spending being 10%?
Amazing.
That would be... So there's that little bit of a libertarian internal aspect, and with the free trade within the British Empire and co-location of industry and all that sort of that happens with empire. But that's what I would be advocating for. If you don't have a world hegemon, well, you're going to have these separate imperial spheres, obviously. But within those imperial spheres and spheres of influence, you're already in the sphere, so you don't need to have protectionist brackets. So you don't need to have protectionist barriers to each other. So just have free trade within the sphere. Yes, sphere to sphere, you're going to be protectionist, but within the sphere, I think the best thing you can hope for is free trade, low tariffs, prosperity, that sort of thing. But we'll see. The libertarian empire.
Right. Empire of Liberty, as Thomas Jefferson put it once. Not sure what he meant by that. Can only do one at a time. Okay. Greed the Avaricious says, what are our thoughts on the conservative populist Green coalition in Austria? So conservative populists are in alliance with the Greens in Austria. I personally have misgivings because the Greens agenda will provide conservatives with an excuse to increase state power to beyond reasonable limits. I did not even know about that coalition. That is interesting. I'm not sure I have any. I know one thing. Populism, as Joe Salerno emphasizes, is a strategy. It is not a policy position. One can use a populist strategy to pursue communism or capitalism or things in between, or war or peace. So just because they're populist doesn't necessarily tell you what kind of governing policies you'll get, right? Do you have any other thoughts on this topic?
No, I think I agree with your comments there.
Okay, let's see. Anything else? Silly ideas for combining our names for the show. Rogers says, back to Understanding Money Mechanics by the series of articles about to be forthcoming from Bob Murphy. Rogers says it's a series of articles that will be compiled into a book similar to Bob Murphy's Contra Krugman. So that sounds cool. So we'll see them as articles and then it'll become a book. And my understanding is, I have found it confusing because Contra Krugman is also the name of the podcast that Tom Woods and Bob Murphy do, where they analyze the articles of Krugman. But my understanding is that his book, Contra Krugman, which I haven't read, is not just a compilation of Tom and Bob talking about Krugman articles. It's actually a different set of content that I've heard is quite good. Did you know anything about it?
No, I don't think it would work well just having the transcript of their podcast in the book.
Right. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Austrian Natcon Green.
Really, 6%? Huh.
6%. I'm sorry.
I'll take your word for it. Oh, we'll get to it. Don't worry.
Okay, keep going. I just had to highlight this because I thought it was funny. Adaman says, if the Tory party has really killed 130,000 people like leftists claim, then Pinochet literally did nothing wrong. Okay. Well, we already addressed, Polyphant brought up the German economic miracle also, but yeah, we addressed that. The solo growth model, you spelled it wrong, SOLOW, a W on the end. I don't want to present the solo growth model, but could you just for the layman, just kind of give a brief idea of what the point of that is? It's a big thing in development economics. It's sort of where the conversation started. It's not where it necessarily is now, right?
Yes, so solo, SOLOW, excuse me. So basically, this is used to try and explain the fantastic growth that Japan and Germany saw after World War II. And they try and show investments. We have a whole stream on it. I think it's actually our first stream that have in this channel.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to go really into depth about it, you can go have a look at it. But quick rundown, you have savings and investments and consumption, and basically optimizing the economy to where savings are low and consumption is high. And it's used to try and explain, oh, wow, well, this is how the Japanese and the Germans got this amazing growth, is that they had high consumption.
Okay, I would like to highlight 3 comments from Liberty et Lesueur. I don't know what Lesueur is. I bet the loans were from very wealthy families funneled through the U.S. government. This creates a large amount of high-interest U.S. Treasury. The government creates a large amount of high-interest U.S. Treasuries, which very wealthy families buy up. I don't have much to say about that, but this last part interested me. They also exported the dollar, which was, in my opinion, part of Americans' plan, create the world currency through the dollar. I do have a strong sense that the U.S. government wants the U.S. dollar to be the world currency and has wanted and pushed for that in various ways over the decades. And they, if you challenge the U.S. dollar supremacy in some way, like by saying you're not going to use U.S. dollars anymore in terms of your world transactions and switch to gold or to a competing currency, people who do that have a tendency to die suddenly soon after they announce they're going to do that. So,
there are no pretenders to the throne.
Yeah, I don't totally know the details, but I gather that the United States government treats this as very serious business. Fair to say, Matt Merck? Am I getting the roughly accurate idea?
Well, after World War II, everything was basically used in US dollars to trade. It used to be the pound, but after World War II, it became the dollar because
Right,
everyone was taking loans from the United States to try and rebuild.
right.
And so everyone just backed everything in the US dollar, and the US dollar was backed in gold. So US dollars were essentially as good as gold until Nixon. But everyone still uses the US dollar for majority of world trade. Something like 80-90% of world trade is still use the international transaction. And so the US in that way has a strong interest to keep that, because if it's your currency being used for pretty much every international transaction, then your currency and what you do with your currency has so much more power and influence, and you can use that influence for your own gain. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just statecraft.
Um, I'm going to do Jeopardy style. I'm going to read the comment, and then you explain what the context was. Roger says, "I swear it used to be as low as approximately 6%." What was he?
British Empire government spending.
Right, and we don't mean when we're talking about this, right? We're not talking about spending on the empire. We're just saying the British government spent 6 or 10% or whatever of GDP, the way we would measure government spending these days, altogether, including anything spent on the empire, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So wow.
That's what I'm saying. I'm completely accepting of the fact that if the United States withdraws from the system, we're going to have spheres of influence and empire zones. I'm completely in favor of that, because that's just natural progression of history, and it's naturally what happens with the incentives of states. We're not going to get rid of that anytime soon. What all I want to advocate for is within those spheres, can we have free trade?
Right.
I don't care if it's protected from other empires. I just want free trade within those spheres.
Lundberg says an example of a sphere is the EU. That's what I was thinking of. It can and probably always will lead to an expansion of an overarching homogenous bureaucracy and direct conflict with libertarianism. That's what I think we see.
I think it's depends on the type of underpinnings of where that sphere came from. So the United States, the Bretton Woods, the global sphere, the underpinnings of that was actually free trade. It was actually freedom. You know, the the rebellion of the United States from taxes and that kind of mentality of living free. Well, that permeated throughout their kind of Cold War alliance. They actually had free trade. They allowed nations to decide for themselves. It's a different ethos to the EU, which is a more continental socialist sort of bureaucratic mess. And I don't want the EU, because the EU its underpinnings are based on like this mixture of corporatist, socialist, oligarchy, sort of the experts know what they're doing, so shut up, you peasant sort of mentality.
Right.
And that's not what I want at all.
Yeah. I'm going to read like two more things and then wrap it up, because I need to get some work done today. I've had to do one other thing that wasn't a work thing today.
Well, do you want to skip these comments and just go on to the other topic that you want to talk about?
I'm going to save it, but I do have a question for everyone after I read one more comment, I think. Yeah, here we go. Greed the Avaricious says, my political creed in brief, I hold that I am a God-believing, realist libertarian, an anti-authoritarian, an atheist to statism, forever and ever, so help me God. Sounds pretty good to me. Question I have is, please comment, everybody, whether you're listening live or listen later. Tell me what you think of the format where we go through a paper. I'm open to doing that more frequently, personally. There's different directions we can take this show, and we are considering all of them. We can have guests. We can go through papers. We can go through papers with guests. We can just talk more casually. I kind of like the meat that the paper gave us. It gave us sort of an outline of things to discuss, gave us some facts and figures and stuff like that. So I kind of liked using the paper as a template, as a sort of a table of contents to go through and guide us through a topic. This paper was really good. I thanked on Twitter Stedman. Oh, shoot. Do you remember?
Nope.
I thanked him on Twitter. But anyway, I shared on Twitter Roger Stedman, I think, something like that, who sent this to us tweeted this paper to us. And this one was really, in my mind, really perfect. It touches on issues of state intervention into the economy. It touches on the Mad Merck type stuff of international relations and the interplay between the economy and what's going on in the international political sphere. So really an amazing paper. I don't know how easy it'd be to find another one that's such a good fit for me, Mad Merck, and sort of what we want to do with this show. But if we did, I'd be curious if people were like, no, don't go through papers, it's too boring or something, or that you like it. So love your feedback on that. And we should be reconvening in 2 weeks from today, right? That should be good.
Yes, so that should be the...
it'd be your January 18th.
18th, and
My
your 17th.
My 17th. Looking good?
All right. Looking good.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. And do please send us suggestions. This topic today was directly from someone shooting us a paper, and we looked at it and thought it was great. So I do hope to sort of pull this show off by not just drawing on knowledge Matt Merck and I have, but by drawing on everybody to help us come up with the things to talk about that are going to be interesting. So, all right. Thanks, Matt Merck. Bye, everybody.
Have a good one.